Here's something I think is really helpful when you're thinking about preaching, is knowing the story of Scripture. Knowing the story of Scripture. When you preach, you have a passage. Maybe it's a handful of verses, maybe it's a chapter. You have a specific defined passage that you're preaching on. You, as the preacher, have the responsibility when you stand up in front of people, or as the teacher, to understand how that passage fits in the rest of the Bible. If you don't understand how it fits in the rest of the Bible, you never will be able to make sense of it in your own brain, much less help other people make sense of it. You've got to know the big picture, the big story of Scripture. So I've taken a bunch of stuff in this section on your notes from James Hamilton. He's written a short book called What is Biblical Theology? And I think he has some really helpful stuff, okay? He says, what is a narrative made of? Well, narratives have setting, characterization, and plot. Plots are built out of episodes and conflict. And if successful, they communicate themes. And what Hamilton is saying to you is the Bible is one big narrative. One big story. Starts in Genesis, ends in Revelation. That's the story. One single story. You've got to understand that one big story if you're ever going to make sense of the little bitty pieces of the story. And so the things you got to make sense of, setting. He talks about that. Parts of the biblical story. The first one is setting. The Bible's set in the world as we know it. Most of its story happens on 3 bodies of land around the Mediterranean Sea. Story is also about the whole world. Okay? Just a helpful piece of advice as you're thinking about setting. One of the most valuable books I have in my office is a Bible atlas. It is so boring to read a Bible atlas. It is so boring. In seminary, I had to read through 2 of them. It is brutal. I can't tell you how many times somebody comes into my office, staff member, church member, with a question, and I say, I know right to where we can find the answer to that question. Bible atlas, right? Bible atlas is super helpful for understanding the setting. Second part of the story, characters. And I like what Hamilton says here. No offense, you're not the main character. You're not the main character in the big story of the world. The triune God is the protagonist of this cosmic drama. Satan as the infinitely outmatched antagonist. This is really important, that when you read the big story of the Bible, you read it with God being the hero. You are not the hero. In my Sunday school class Sunday, we talked about Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. And we very clearly made the point. Philip is not the hero of this story. The eunuch is not the hero of this story. Who does that leave in the story to be the hero? God's the hero of this story. It is mostly about God and what He's doing. It is only secondarily about Philip or about this eunuch. So you've got to know the characters. Thirdly, the plot. And he's helpful here. He says, in the broadest terms, the Bible's plot can be summarized in 4 words: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. That's 4 words that summarize Genesis to Revelation, what the whole story's about. So I'll just give you an example of why I think this is important. In 2010, my family moved to Oklahoma. And we had just been in Kentucky, and I'd been working through a PhD program. And there was a guy that I studied with there named Michael Clark, and he graduated world religions guy. He wasn't in my degree program, but we took a lot of classes together. He ended up in Oklahoma. He worked for Oklahoma Baptist University, and he was hiring guys who would teach online courses. They had online courses, but they're just starting to ramp them up. And he knew me, and he knew I was in Oklahoma, and he said, hey, I need someone to teach Old Testament. And I said, Michael, that is the least interesting topic to me of anything I might teach at OBU, and it's the thing I'm least qualified to teach. You could find 1 million people who could do that better than me. And he said, no, I want you to do it. And he talked me into it. And so I walked into this class thinking, I have absolutely no clue how to teach Old Testament. It is not what I just did my PhD in. It was not an emphasis in my master's degree. How in the world am I going to teach Old Testament to a bunch of college kids? And so I'm I'm thinking about how do I want to approach this. I could teach it any way that I wanted to teach it. And as I thought about it and as I prayed about it, my conclusion is my biggest struggle with the Old Testament, when I was a college kid, a high school kid, a seminary guy, whatever, is that there's so much weird stuff in there you have no idea what's going on. And if you pay attention at all, you realize pretty quick it's not all in chronological order. Like you're tracking along pretty good, and then all of a sudden there's going backwards and it's going forwards and it's rehashing and all this sort of stuff. And it gets confusing real quick. And so my thought is, if you're going to make sense of the Old Testament, you got to know the big storyline. And so I gave this 12-word, that's a nice Old Testament number, 12-word Old Testament summary. And the very first thing the kids in that class had to do, OBU, Old Testament 1, memorize those 12 words. Now, can you argue with those words? Could you say, well, you should take this one out and put this one in, or you left this out, or this, whatever. You come up with your own 12 words. I don't care. The point is, if you get these 12 words, you at least have some big, broad framework for what's going on. And when you read about someone or something or a book, you got a place to file it. And you understand where it fits in the broad story. The New Testament's easier, but you still need to know the big picture. Especially when it comes to exegesis and you're drawing out the meaning of a text, you've got to understand, well, where am I at here? Which side of the cross am I on? That's important a lot of the time. Which side of Pentecost am I on? That's important a lot of the time. You just got to know these big picture summaries of the Old Testament and of the New Testament. I didn't put this in your notes, but what's true for Old Testament, New Testament Bible is also true for an individual book, okay? In high school, I walked in my first day of high school and I sat in advanced calculus. And they handed me my schedule with some information, and I realized I don't need advanced calculus to graduate high school. And as soon as class was over, I went to the counselor and said, I would like to transfer out of advanced calculus. What are my options? And she said, your option is New Testament. And I said, sign me up. So I took New Testament from a 90-year-old Church of Christ guy at Amarillo High School. It was a fascinating class because I disagreed with him about a lot of stuff. He was wrong and I was right. Senior in high school, I knew everything. One of the things he made us do is he made us study the book of Acts. And he made us memorize 2 events from every chapter in the book of Acts. And at the time I thought, this is so stupid. I don't need to know this. This isn't helpful. This is busy work. This has no spiritual value. Why can't we talk about doctrine or theology or something controversial? Why do I have to memorize all the chapters in the book of Acts? What happened in all of them? Then, fast forward a few years, I'm a pastor and I'm preaching through Acts. And what do I have filed away in my brain? 2 things that happened in every chapter in the book of Acts. Do you know how many times when I was preaching through the book of Acts, I knew what was coming 2 chapters ahead, and it changed the way I preached what was happening in chapter 5. If you don't know the big story, if you don't remember what happened behind, or you don't know what's coming up, you just stumble your way through it, and you end up saying all sorts of stuff that when you get to a later chapter, you're like, oh, I guess I was wrong about that. Wish I hadn't popped off and said it that way. You got to know the big picture. You got to know the big story of a book or of the New Testament or the Old Testament or the Bible. Here's a big picture summary of the Bible from Hamilton, right? A central theme. The Bible's central theme is the glory of God in salvation through judgment. Hamilton's written a book on that sentence. It's phenomenal. And the questions he's asking here is, how does a particular story, or you could say passage, how does my passage contribute to the big story? I need to know where it fits in the big story, and I need to understand how does this particular story tell the same big story of the Bible. Both of those things are true of every little passage in the Bible. In some way they contribute to the big story, or in some way they repeat the same big story of the Bible, which is God's glory and salvation through judgment. Okay, how do you put all these pieces together? This is high level rocket science. I should make you pay for this stuff. Are you ready? The best way to learn biblical theology, the best way to get yourself out of the world's way of thinking and into the Bible's, is to study the Bible itself. That's it. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. Read the Bible a lot. I found the best way for me to see the interconnectedness of the Bible, meaning the big story, is to read big chunks of the Bible at one sitting. Look, I sat in a Sunday school class when I was a seminary student with one of the smartest faculty members at our seminary. And it was mostly seminary guys and their wives in this class. And one morning we had a little Q&A time, and one of the guys said to this professor, our Sunday school teacher, "I want to preach like you. Tell me how to do it." And his answer was, "Go home, read your English Bible over and over and over and over and over again." And I thought, as a brand new seminary student, that's the dumbest answer I've ever heard in my life. That is absolutely ridiculous. Why couldn't you just tell us how to do what it is you're doing? That's exactly what Hamilton is telling you to do. It's really a good answer. Just read the Bible a lot. In English, in a good translation. Read it over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Big chunks. Don't always spend your time drilling down into every nuance of every word, of every sentence, of every phrase, of every whatever. Read the Bible and see the big picture of it. I've given you some resources if you want to grow in this area, okay? The first three are really, really short books. Our staff read the second one, the Bruno book. It's very helpful. The last three are larger. They're slogs to get through. They're tough to get through, but they really are valuable in helping you see the big picture of the Bible. And if you are going to do justice to an individual passage, you don't have to know everything about the Bible. You do have to understand the big story of the Bible. And you have to understand, how does Ruth, how does Job, how does Hezekiah, how does Jonah, how does Peter walking on water, how does Ananias and Sapphira dying in church, how does this contribute to the one big story that the Bible is telling? You've got to be able to put your passage into that context, okay?